A lot of people have asked for my opinion on the Stan Lee-Jack Kirby partnership, and did Stan Lee take advantage of Jack Kirby? Was the relationship very one-sided? Did the great ideas all come from Jack Kirby? And did Stan Lee basically take advantage of it? It's a complex story that would take hours and hours and hours to get into, but I'll kind of give the overview, and if you're interested, I'll be happy to give in more. But let's try it out. Hey everybody, this is Perch. Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, Marvel Comics in the Silver Age. That was a fairly legendary team up, and maybe the most famous team up in all of comics. I'd have a hard time thinking of two names that you put them together and they're not more synonymous with the comic industry. I think that first, a couple things that most people I'm sure already know, but for one. Jack Kirby did have a career prior to Stan Lee, actually a big career. By the time he and Stan Lee came around in the early 60s, Jack Kirby had created a ton of comics. He'd worked in romance, if you can believe that. But a lot of people, and I was really fascinated to learn that Jack Kirby, when he worked with Joe Simon, and this is back in the 40s, I think, maybe even maybe in the late 30s, but definitely by the 40s. Jack Kirby was doing Captain America. He was he was very much into comics and superheroes and and a lot of things. I think Captain America, which actually really did come about in the late 40s. Kirby had a decade-long career in comics, and he had done a lot. He was well known in the industry, and it was there that he actually met Stan Lee, and kind of Kirby's first dust up in terms of kind of pay and rights was during that in the 40s when he and Simon basically kind of renegotiated their pay and that. And basically that, and there was a whole kind of mess around kind of their plans and doing more in comics and arguments they had, which caused Kirby and Simon to be pushed off of Captain America. So there's a lot of history here, back in the day. And Kirby had met Lee back during that time. And then later, again in the 60s, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby kind of come together and they work on Fantastic Four. But there had been a lot of comics before that, and it's important to note that because number one, a lot of the story has been kind of rewritten. I think in recent times that Jack Kirby kind of was a young up and comer when he met Stan Lee, which is just grossly inaccurate. I mean, it's like 30 years inaccurate of rich comic history before Stan Lee and Kirby did Fantastic Four #1. And also that it was that I've heard this story often by kind of people who really like Kirby, saying he never really objected to anything, never really he was a team player. Until he met Stan Lee, and then Stan Lee kind of screwed him over, and then that forced Jack Kirby to reluctantly kind of start to look out for himself. And I think that's again very inaccurate. There are lots of times prior to the 60s where Jack Kirby was kind of looking out for himself in terms of wanting more money, wanting more rights, and I mean he went through a struggle around Captain America, a really big struggle there, and he had a lot of history of kind of fighting for himself. This wasn't a new thing. It certainly wasn't because of Stan Lee. And I mean, there's this character in the 50s called Fighting American that, at any rate, that Kirby and Simon launched. It was really designed to be a counter to Captain America in the case of Fighting American. So there's a lot that was going on. I think the key, if you're looking at Kirby's life, is to understand that there was a lot to it prior to Stan Lee. However, the two are linked. The two are linked because in the 60s, you saw the Fantastic Four, and then you saw the Hulk and Thor and Iron Man and the original X-Men, and tons of, I mean, just tons. The basis of what Marvel Comics is today is Jack Kirby and Stan Lee together. Now, there's been a lot of comments about the ideas were all Kirby's, and Stan Lee was pretty irrelevant to the picture. And here's where it's you're going to believe you're going to come down on one side or the other, and you're going to believe kind of one thing or not. But I think if I look at Jack Kirby's work prior to the '60s, and I look at Jack Kirby's work later when he did New Gods and kind of other things later in his career. I think that you could definitely see when Jack Kirby was working on his own and when he was inventing, and that was a powerful force. New Gods was huge and very inventive and creative and a lot of pieces to it. But we also saw Commandi and the Demon and he worked with Joe Simon at the end doing a new Sandman, and there's a lot that Kirby did, and you could see his work. The evidence is there. And at DC, he did seem to have more control over his own, kind of mandate of what he wanted to do, particularly with New Gods. Now, if you hold New Gods up to, say, the Fantastic Four and Iron Man and X-Men and some of these, you can quickly, I think, pick out that, the stuff that definitely was Kirby and the stuff that didn't feel like Kirby. And I would argue that the success of those early Marvel comics required both elements. It required a Jack Kirby and it required a Stan Lee, who I haven't talked about much in this video, but kind of switching gears for a second. Stan Lee was, we've heard him be a writer, an editor. We've heard a lot about, what Stan Lee was. But I think more than anything, and it's maybe why there's such a problem in the comic industry today, is Stan Lee was a powerful marketer. He was marketing. He was an evangelist. He was a pitchman for Marvel. And I think the comic industry today, included today, needs that role badly. I think it's a hugely missing role of somebody who's an evangelist for the comics, for their line. Now, Stan Lee was very, very effective at that. And I think he also, because he had a marketing brain, he was able to kind of polish the edges. He was able to align the comics in a way that was going to work for the mass audience, for huge amounts of people. And I think you take somebody who is creative and just could see through his imagination, just every angle, every detail in Jack Kirby, and you partner that with somebody who's a powerful, guy who can take a concept and a project and can get mass appeal out of it in Stan Lee, and I think you've got just a powerful platform together. And I think the two of those was what made Marvel work in the '60s. I think if it had just been Jack Kirby, it wouldn't have worked. If it would have been just Stan Lee, it wouldn't have worked. The two together is what made it work. And I think that was what revolutionized the industry with kind of, big idea, high concept, huge imagination art, and kind of, storytelling that could appeal to anyone who picked the comic up. And so, throughout the '60s, and I think Stan Lee also, Stan Lee is this interesting character because his legacy is often goes between positive and negative. When he first died, he was kind of the legendary Stan Lee and somebody we'll never, have again. And then, it goes back to kind of the evil, manipulative Stan Lee. There's always this desire to kind of portray Stan Lee as this kind of con artist. And I think that's unfair to Lee. I don't think that's necessarily accurate. And I think that it ignores kind of the big contribution he made, which was, to really kind of shape this company. Stan Lee was, recognized that Jack Kirby was incredible in what he could do, and Jack Kirby basically defined Marvel. He was the one who, his view of how to draw and how to create was what Marvel used as kind of the Bible for their group. And it is, and Stan Lee also knew enough, I think, to recognize that he needed to have a blend of art styles. He when he saw Kirby's work on Spider-Man, he believed it was a wrong fit, and we turned to Steve Ditko to do Spider-Man. And of course, that created a very different field, very different approach. Um, and then, of course, things broke down. Kirby, toward the end of the '60s, got very unhappy working for Marvel, and many of it was, people say it was money, but a lot of it was at a different guy who we don't talk about as much, called Martin Goodman, who made a lot of promises. He was kind of, in many ways, like a shill, like Lee, but worse at keeping his promises. I'm condensing again like an hour's worth of context into a sentence, but that's where a lot of the frustration came in. A lot of the bitterness with Jack Kirby was not aimed at Stan Lee, but was actually aimed at Martin Goodman. That's where some really big issues came in. And then the secondary item was around ownership. And so what was a tipping point was when a contract got served to Kirby that had some really kind of, it just boxed him in quite a bit, and Kirby was refused to take those changes and was poached by DC at the time. And I think we've heard a lot about Jack Kirby didn't like Stan Lee's style. He didn't like his his kind of marketing kind of attitude and behavior. But it is, I think that was a factor. I don't think it was, Kirby's personality was definitely more grounded, which is weird because his imagination was bigger than life, but his personality was definitely lended itself to a more grounded, more humble approach. And Stan Lee was a, carnival barker. And so, those two personalities were very successful together in terms of what they could bring, but like kind of oil and water, they don't necessarily mix as partners. But all the same, people also forget that Jack Kirby went back to Marvel in the late '70s. He returned, and and that was a lot. He didn't. He still was pleased to work with with Stan Lee, and I think he it was money and it worked. I think that Kirby's issues always seem to come slightly higher up. I think whether it was, at Marvel with Martin Goodman, or whether it was later at DC with, just kind of the various policies and kind of legal management. It objected to what Kirby grew up with, and it was a new era. It was very different from what Kirby lived in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, which is why that part of his life is so important. He was hanging on to a lot of that element of who he was. And so, as things changed, Kirby struggled to change with it. And I'm not saying he should have had to. I think some of the policies back then were a lot better than they are today. But Kirby always did fight for himself. He wasn't this kind of poor artist who was continuously taken advantage of, like some people like to portray. But he definitely did some powerful work. He's responsible for Black Panther and the Eternals, in addition to those other comics I mentioned. As I said, New Gods was all Kirby. So it's interesting to see kind of how Kirby rolled out. He definitely had a lot of fights around ownership in particular, and pages that he had done, and people, again, a lot of those attach those to Stan Lee, and I don't think the Kirby Stan Lee disagreement or fight was anywhere close to the top conflict he had in his life. In most cases, it was definitely with other people at Marvel, higher up, their legal teams and others, and that was. That was basically, and some really douchey things. I mean, right at the end of his life, I remember Marvel basically told him that his art was created for hire, and so he would have to forego all future royalties. And if he signed the agreement, they'd give him 88 pages, less, which famously is less than 1% of he did. But then, if Kirby violated the deal on any level, they would grab back the art. And so that led to some real ugliness, which is which is sad that it was kind of in. But at any rate, I think that as people, to kind of wrap this up, and then you tell me if you want to hear more. I could go on for 2 or 3 hours on this topic. The key here is that Stan Lee is and Jack Kirby is not the toxic relationship a lot of people portray. I mean, I'm not saying they were best buds. They were not. But the issues that Kirby had went to other places. And then some have claimed it was Stan Lee who was driving a lot of these things that made Jack Kirby mad. But there's very little evidence. When I say very little, I mean no evidence that that is the case. Stan Lee did not have that kind of influence, and Stan Lee would have issues himself with Marvel, as we saw in the 90s and other times when Stan Lee would work for other companies. Stan Lee's this perception that Stan Lee ran the whole show at Marvel was not accurate. There were other people involved, and there were lawyers and other things. So, again, please understand the nuance here. I'm not saying that they were best buds and that all angst or problems between the two was imagined. Not saying that at all. But I am saying that there were other people that drove a lot of that disagreement and Kirby's issues within Marvel. Like the names I mentioned, and that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby as a team created magic. No question about it. Just created absolute magic in comics. And had they not collaborated, we wouldn't have seen a lot of what we have today. But anyway, let me know your thoughts, your questions, if you'd like to hear more about it. It's an interesting time in comic history, and it's an interesting one because it gets kind of rewritten over time. So subscribe, click the bell for notifications, downvote if you do whatever you want. Follow me on social media, and thanks for listening.